We have looked at bipedalism already, and the main hypothesis that has been proposed and generally propagated has been that during the Miocene-Pliocene boundary, ranging somewhere from 10 million years ago to about 2.5 million years ago, before the Pleistocene glaciations started, the vegetation, East African acidification, etc., changed the need for foraging versus avoiding prey, avoiding predators, and so on. And the general idea has been that when you have lush green forest and hiding places and food availability, then you remain arboreal and quadrupedal, whereas when you have savanna kind of habitats, you begin to savanna mosaic. Let's say you need to walk longer, farther, maybe run faster to avoid predators and so on, and that this would have somehow selected for bipedalism. And then we extend that argument saying that would have, standing erect would have changed the connection between the spine and the cranium, and then the cranial expansion, brain growth, and then everything else follows. This has been the dominant hypothesis. And now a new study actually takes a slightly different approach, where they go to the regions where we know the hominin to various species of hominins evolution happened before diaspora and other things. Building tools, sharing technology, networks, etc. happened. So if you go there during the present time and look at the chimpanzees in different habitats, in the savanna mosaic versus the forest and woodland habitats, do you get any sense of how they are using bipedalism or terrestriality versus arboreality to get around in terms of foraging versus locomotion? And you have to also match it back then to the kind of diets of our ancestors we inferred from dental evidences. If it was C3 rich diet, did it indicate more arboreal foraging? And then how did terrestrial locomotion combine with arboreal diets to link back to evolution of bipedalism, right? These are kind of interesting issues. I won't go into the details here, but basically what the group did, the team did, was to find the chimpanzees in different locations, as I said, with different mix of savanna mosaic and forests, and look at the chimpanzees that are native to those regions and see whether terrestriality really differs significantly from those that live in the forests versus those that live in savanna mosaic, and whether locomotion happens mostly during foraging or other activities. And you can compare them to say whether terrestriality is significantly higher in the savanna mosaic chimpanzees. So this is what this is showing. The percentage of time spent in locomotion, and specifically terrestrial locomotion, of Issa Valley chimpanzees in comparison to other chimpanzee communities. Issa Valley being the savanna mosaic, serving as an analog for evolution of bipedalism versus forest-dwelling chimpanzees, which then presumably would apply to us as well. So this is the percentage of locomotor behavior spent terrestrially in percentage, and percentage of all position, percentage of all positional behavior spent as locomotion. So positional is where you may just stand up but not doing locomotion, or you could be walking on quadrupedal and bipedal. And so if you look at the total locomotion versus percentage spent terrestrially, Issa woodland and Issa forest are different. So Issa woodland does have higher terrestriality and locomotion, but it's not so directly related to the vegetation itself, because other things can be compared, as we will see in a minute. And this is the density of the percentage, the dot density represents relative vegetation openness So you can basically see different regions to see how the vegetation density affects the percentage of time that bipedalism is used for locomotion as opposed to foraging, assuming foraging is mostly happening in the trees, and then there are details of how the vegetation itself is structured and so on, right? So just to say, the between community comparison showed no increase in terrestrial locomotion as forest cover decreases. Issa chimpanzees spent less time locomoting terrestrially than all forest sites except Kibale. Okay, so that means basically the dominant species in savanna mosaic do not show increased terrestriality compared to increased vegetation densities. Okay, chimpanzee bipedalism at Issa Valley. Look at terrestrial and arboreal, and look at foraging and other times when bipedalism is important. So you can see here the difference. This is just not necessarily locomotion, but let's say positional bipedalism. A percentage of bipedalism is the percentage of bipedalism, posture, and locomotion combined on terrestrial versus arboreal substrates depicted by light gray here, 14% and 84%. They sum to 100%. Colored bars in front summed to 100%, so 5, 14, 83 and 100 if you add these, right? Okay, I don't want to lose my... Colored bars in front depict percentage of bipedalism on each substrate split across the behavioral context in which the chimpanzees were using bipedalism, divided in foraging in orange versus other behaviors blue, i.e. travel, vigilance and play. So you could be just standing up to see if there is anything trouble brewing on the horizon, or you could be playing, or you could be just traveling and not necessarily running away from predators and so on. Error bars represent SE, so standard errors. Bipedalism in Issa chimpanzees was primarily an arboreal versus terrestrial and foraging behavior. So 73% of the time forage versus other behavior in arboreal context. Example of terrestrial postural bipedalism here, an example of arboreal here, and arboreal locomotor bipedalism here during foraging. So there is bipedalism. It's increased in the savanna mosaic chimpanzees, but not necessarily for terrestrial locomotion. Chimpanzee bipedal locomotion versus bipedal posture. Again, comparing different regions with different forests, the conclusion is similar. Issa has the highest percentage of bipedal behavior as locomotion, but there appears to be no relationship between the overall frequency of bipedalism and habitat type. Thai and Kibale are not included as no or insufficient data on the percentage of bipedal behavior spent as locomotion were available. This is the example of Issa chimpanzee foraging in open canopy vegetation in a large tree which is greater than 10 meter high with a wide crown and many terminal branch. Foods were here hypothesized to select for arboreal bipedalism at Issa. So there is arboreal bipedalism versus terrestrial bipedalism, and when we want to apply it to humans, we are hominins, we are generally looking for terrestrial bipedalism as an evolutionary feature. So summary: chimpanzee terrestriality in a savanna mosaic habitat. Issa chimpanzees increased their terrestrial overall in open or woodland vegetation compared to the forest, reflecting the importance of vegetation structure on ape substrate during locomotion. Example given: lower tree density and canopy connectivity in open vegetation reduce horizontal pathways within the canopy, increasing terrestrial travel between feeding trees. So you are moving to feed trees. However, Issa chimpanzees were no more terrestrial in woodland vegetation than chimpanzees living in forest habitats, suggesting that it's not a simple rule of less trees means more time on the ground. While intersite variation in, for example, observation technique, level of habituation, and predator presence may exist in the analysis, contextual activity was an important variable determining chimpanzee ground use during locomotion between open and closed vegetation at ISA. So, furthermore, hominin arboreality is consistent with dental microwear and food mechanical properties of hominins before 4 million years ago, showing a C3-rich diet that is similar to that of extant savanna mosaic chimpanzees. ISA chimpanzee positional behavior therefore provides a model for how early hominins could have maintained a C3-rich diet, arboreal diet, in a savanna mosaic habitat, foraging arboreally at equal if not more frequent rates to forest conspecifics, to effectively harvest abundant but spatially restricted food sources, and to counterbalance energy loss through increased travel distances between widely distributed food patches. Many parameters to consider, and this is just adding one more piece to the puzzle that obviously not completely resolved by this, but at least raises issues about whether habitat changes, East African nidification were critical for bipedalism to become dominant as a terrestrial locomotion. Ecological heterogeneity here provided important foods across an increasingly seasonal environment, and the selective pressures that promote and explain the presence and persistence of hominin postcranial functional morphology, advantageous for bipedal and arboreal locomotion. So postcranial is basically after the cranium volume grew and other brain evolutions and advantages began to play a role in the evolution. The high frequency of arboreal behavior in an open vegetation combined with high frequency of bipedal locomotion at ISA provides insight into two long-standing debates in paleoanthropology, that bipedalism evolved as an arboreal locomotor behavior before being exapted to a terrestrial context. As you remember, exapt is something that is adaptation in one context and then is applied elsewhere because it's advantageous as well. And secondly, that the arboreal features retained in many early and even late hominins living in open habitats were functionally significant and adaptive. Life in the trees was likely an essential component of the hominin adaptive niche, even as forests retreated. So just keep these things in mind, take it for what it is, and just see that there is still a debate about exactly how, where, when, and why bipedalism evolved, and it's possible that it's not as simple as climate change, vegetation change, habitat changes, need to move, forage, run from predators, etc. The environmental determinism is still something that can be oversimplification in many contexts. Okay.